Um, so I was looking into some of the brain structures and why people think there's such a thing as porn addiction, and what that actually looks like in the brain, and how they're misusing the word addiction and misunderstanding it, and what actually goes on. So you know me, anything has to relate back to the brain.
No, I'm just so excited to not be the only one saying it. You know, I caught a little bit of your conversation with MD Aware on Truth Wanted the other night, where y'all were talking about some of these issues.
Yeah.
Truth Wanted every Friday night at 7. Encourage people to check it out. And I basically 2 months ago was on there saying kind of the same things. Like, porn is not addictive. Porn is not addictive. Porn is not addictive. If you have watched this show, you've heard that message before, and yet people don't want to believe it. And there's a lot of patriarchal bullshit as to why that's true. There's a lot of religious bullshit and shame and guilt that's mixed into it. And not for nothing, but there are some very, very shady for-profit treatment centers that get a lot of money by selling you a cure to a imaginary disease. So it is a fraught issue, and I'm glad you're having a good time diving in and I guess correcting some of the bullshit there.
Yeah, I think part of the reason that people see it as an addiction is because it's stigmatized. So it has a negative connotation to it by virtue of how people in your community.
If you do it at all, it must be out of your control.
Right, exactly. And is negative and detrimental, and is causing like an impact on your life that's negative, and is causing a physiological detriment to you. And those things just aren't the case, really. Like, you can like something and it not have a negative impact. A lot of the reason that people think it has a negative impact is because they've been instilled with a significant amount of guilt surrounding their consumption, utilization of porn. And that guilt gives them a negative impact, but that's not a result of porn consumption. That's a result of the conceptualization of what porn consumption means, and not being able to kind of like shirk off the fact that that's an incorrect assumption, and you're actually not hurting yourself or anybody else by consuming it, so long as the people involved in creating it are doing so with informed consent. So, yeah.
No, religion can be like caffeine in that way, because you feel tired, you're not in a great shape, so you reach for a Coke or a cup of coffee, and all of a sudden you feel a little bit more energized, you feel better. But what you don't really recognize is the fact that you felt shitty in the first place because you're addicted to caffeine, and because you haven't been getting good sleep, again, because of the caffeine. But you get that hit of caffeine and you feel better. Religion comes in and says that if you feel bad about your porn use, if you feel bad about your sexuality, well, just turn to us, turn to God or whatever else, and we'll fix it for you. When in reality, there was no need to feel bad in the first place. And the person selling us the solution is the one who created the problem at the beginning.
Yeah. And they misuse neuroscience in order to reinforce their points. I'm so glad that you said about sexuality, because I think that they are kind of akin to each other. Like, they're analogous in the way that they're presented, that just you know, being attracted to somebody of the same sex, for example, is something that is dangerous and detrimental and you should be ashamed of. When in fact that it isn't. It's the same thing with pornography. Like, in and of itself, it's not harming you. But they misuse neuroscience because there's centers in your brain that when you have an addiction, a lot of the times there's a dopaminergic response, right? So your dopamine centers become overactive. And there was some studies that were done that said, you know, in people who use porn a great deal, their ventral striatums, and the ventral striatum. Hey, I did use the word. This is the word that I forgot. Before this started, I completely forgot the word. But the ventral striatum is a part of your brain that regulates dopamine responses based on subjective assessments of your external stimuli. So if there's something that you like or enjoy or know you're going to have a good mental or physiological response to, your brain basically goes, oh, we're going to like this thing. We're going to like this thing, right? And then it gives you a dopamine hit, and that feels good. So sometimes if you have like a form of depression, you may overutilize porn more than you would if you were in like a stable mental state, as a form of like self-soothing. It's not really hurting you. It's not doing it. It's not solving the problem. It could be a crutch. But they look at that type of thing and they say, okay, well, there's overactive ventral striatums in people who are using porn more than the average person. but they're not contextualizing it or looking at any of the nuance of why that may be the case. And they're still not showing anything detrimental, because that's not brain damage. You can have an overactive ventral striatum if you're somebody who's sensation seeking and you like going skydiving, for example. That's admittedly more dangerous. Admittedly, definitionally, it's more dangerous, but you may have the same activation in your brain regions. The only difference between the two scenarios is that one of them is stigmatized in the public consciousness, and the other one is seen as like a fun, interesting activity to go and do. That's the only difference between the two, but your brain may be acting the same. It's just the outlet that you choose.
Yeah, well, and I guess while we're here, it's worth it to point out what that word addiction does and doesn't mean, because that is my biggest sticking point with all of this, is that we just so carelessly and casually throw the word addiction around, which does not do a service to people who are struggling with substance abuse issues, to people who are experiencing meaningful distress with pornography. So since we're talking about it, can you kind of pull out the differences there?
I can do my best. You're a clinician and I am not. So I am going to lean on you to correct me where I don't include enough nuance here. But the way I see it and my understanding of it is that something becomes an addiction if it has like a serious, a detrimental physiological or social or mental deficit, that like something deleterious is going to happen to you as a result of engaging in this activity consistently, or something, or that you're going to like withdraw from friends and family as a result of doing this. You're going to take more risks as a result of doing it. You're going to cause yourself physical harm as a result of doing it. You're going to drain yourself monetarily as a result of doing it. Some combination of that, I think, would be considered an addiction, but I am not a clinician, so I'm going to need you to correct all of the things that I just said.
So the distress aspect is the significant component with the way a lot of people use that word, but everything that you just described would qualify for a chemical addiction and possibly this new category that we sort of carelessly throw around that I really am not a fan of, and I'm not trying to get too esoteric in the debates of it, but this idea of process addictions, because everything that you just described could be said about golf, could be said about video games, could be said about any number of things that you spend money on or that you invest yourself in ways that could potentially cause tension in your relationships, could get you fired from your job, like those kinds of things. And those things don't involve a withdrawal component. And I feel like that is a incredibly important thing that we maintain, that we only use the word addiction to describe things that actually entail a chemical withdrawal component, because otherwise we're taking this word that has a medical definition that is necessary and vital to understanding people with substance abuse issues, and we are misapplying it to everybody who maybe plays more golf than they should and is getting a divorce because of it. If you're playing so much golf that it's causing a divorce, that's a concern. That's a very real problem. And we need a word for that, but we should use a word that actually applies to that particular problem and doesn't lump it in with something that has a completely different and very significant aspect to it.
Oh, that is such a good point, because you could classify almost any hobby.
Yeah, and people do. And you see these like silly BuzzFeed articles about how people in China are addicted to video games and all of this kind of stuff. And I know that there are clinicians that use that term in that way. I'm not going to pretend that I have a monopoly on what words mean. I am going to say that we as a culture and as a society need to do a better job of policing certain words when our usage is causing demonstrable harm. And I think that we can say overwhelmingly here that this use of that word in that way is really fucking up a lot of good people's lives.
Would you consider, now I have a question for you, because that's made me think.
Yeah.
So is it possible that something could not have the withdrawal potentially in the way that we can conceptualize it usually, which is that, there's a neurochemical imbalance and we've used something to substitute or artificially inflate certain neurochemicals. But if you do something consistently enough to the point of like constant repetition and to like the exclusion of almost anything else that you need to do to like maintain your life, there could be an aspect of it physiologically rewiring aspects of your brain. So you wouldn't necessarily have the withdrawal component from a chemical standpoint, but now you don't have necessarily the skill set or the mental capacity to figure out how to operate without it. And that, I suppose that could be just a different type of withdrawal.
I mean, you can frame it that way, I suppose, but really what you're describing, if we want to get cute with it, is all of neuroscience, right? Like you can basically distill down everything that we know about neuroscience into the idea that practice makes perfect, or that the more time you spend on something, the better you get at it. Every time you listen to that cheesy pop song, you're not getting addicted to it, but by listening to it over and over and over, you're increasing myelination. You are increasing, I mean, you're physically changing the shape and structure of your brain.
Yeah.
But as much as I might be tempted to call it that, Carly Rae Jepsen is not brain damaged. And it is just asinine to me that we are taking these processes that are identical to, when you look at a flower, when you pet a puppy, and then we're saying, oh, well, your brain lights up like you're on cocaine. It doesn't. Like, yes, it lights up in a manner similar and consistent to, but the degree is completely different. And there's not that chemical withdrawal component that would then override other decision-making processes. Is it the same? I guess on a philosophical level, if we really want to be existential and say that like everything is everything, but in any kind of meaningful way, that feels like such an oversimplification as to have lost the fucking point entirely.
Interesting. Cool. That gives me something to think about. Like I said, I'm not a clinician. I just find these things interesting to explore. So I always wonder like where the line is from a clinical perspective. So it's good for me to have the conversation.
Well, I mean, so that's more of a neuroscience thought, but in terms of clinical, I feel like that's where we get into trouble, because there are people in therapy offices that will say, oh, you're addicted to golf. Oh, you're addicted to video games because of the distress that it's causing in your life. And I recognize that distress is meaningful. It's just really problematic to me to apply terminology to it that kind of misrepresents it. We can feel out of control in our sexual behavior or in our habits, but we don't regain control from a golf addiction in the same way that we regain control from a cocaine addiction. And there's like a meaningful difference on a physiological, neurochemical level that should not be glossed over.
Interesting. So you wouldn't call something an addiction. This is going to sound like a question, but it's me formulating thoughts.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't call something an addiction if it's something that you could essentially just make a behavioral decision and change, but are choosing not to for reasons other than a physiological necessity, but rather more so like a mental desire. So like playing too much golf to the detriment of being at home with your wife might be a sign potentially that you're looking to avoid your wife. And this is just a symptom of this is your outlet to avoid that consequence. But that's not an addiction. That's a symptom of a completely different issue.
Yeah, there are just so many better models.
Yeah,
there's so many better ways to understand that guy who is playing too much golf and avoiding his wife. Maybe we should be talking about avoidance. Maybe we should be talking about like attachment style. Maybe we should be talking about anxiety. I mean, there are chemical components to these things, but there's chemical components to being alive, to being a person. So to pathologize those processes when they are working appropriately, rather than to pathologize the behavior, is to kind of demonize the wrong thing, I think.
Right. Yeah. So you would be like treating a symptom instead of the disease. So we'll use the golf guy analogy again. Like, so if he comes in and you treat the too much golfing as though that's the addiction, as though that's his problem.
Right. Like we don't need to titrate the number of holes that he's on or talk about like going, cold turkey and selling all, breaking up with his country club. Like that's a very different framework than what we should be doing, because with that person who's playing too much golf, why is he playing so much golf?
Exactly.
It's not the
That
golf
makes so
itself.
much more
Like,
sense to me.
and you could say the same thing about heroin. Like, oh, it's not the heroin. It's because life is so miserable. But from a chemical standpoint, when you're going through withdrawals and your body cannot function and you cannot think straight, it becomes the heroin. Maybe it started because of recklessness or recreational ideas or avoidance. Like maybe it started for those socio-cultural reasons, but it's become a chemical reason by the time that you have a addiction to it.
That helps to contextualize it a lot better for me. This was a helpful conversation. See, this is why I wanted to come here. This is
You know what they say, if you can reach just one person, it's all worth it.
You did it. This is why the psychology fields need to get together more often, because I think that like the neuroscientists, I don't know if you felt the same way, but like when I was going to university, like we in the cognitive neuroscience parts of the university would look at the behaviorists and be like, oh my God, the dog people. Oh, you guys don't even have it right. Like it's the same sort of thing, but we all need to kind of work cohesively and understand each other's fields in order to help people.
I had a roommate that was I think working on a PhD in some form of neuroscience, and he had a mini fridge and a espresso machine in his room so that he didn't have to leave to make a latte, so that he could like stay at his desk. And I remember at a certain point being like, you know, I think sleep might be more important in passing this test than having, you know, another latte. Like, I'm not sure this is the best thing for you. And he would just turn to me and be like, well, really, all I'm doing is lowering the action potential threshold for the dopaminergic reaction within the negostriatal pathway, or like whatever he was talking about. And I remember thinking,
I'm that guy.
We are not the same. We are not the same. I'm thinking sleep is good for you. That's what a therapist thinks. You're thinking on a totally different planet.
Should have asked him, what are you doing to your GABA? Your circadian rhythms are all off. Your GABA production is going to be a mess. You need to re-regulate. Might have gotten him.
Different world. Well, so if that's what's turning us on, let's keep going. Let's talk a little more neuroscience and a little more, I guess, pornography and talk about arousal.
Yes.
For the rest of our purposes tonight, when we say arousal, what are we actually referring to? How do we define that term here?
Oh, that is such a loaded question.
Sure.
Because from a neuroscience, like from a cognitive perspective, even not just neuroscience, but from a cognitive perspective, arousal levels can mean myriad things. You can mean physiological arousal. So you can mean the actual level of physiological like reaction that you're having to some sort of stimuli. You can mean it's kind of replaced for the word like alertness or attentiveness, like the amount of attention that you're paying towards something and your interest in that thing, I guess would be a good way to put it. That can be a form of arousal. How you feel about that thing and how strong that feeling is about that thing or person or concept could be considered arousal as well. It's kind of like a gradient scale that determines how you feel physiologically, mentally, or emotionally about some form of stimuli. That's the way I would perceive it. Is it different from a clinical standpoint, or are we in line, do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think broadly speaking, that is a pretty apt definition. But as we're getting into it tonight, what I'm really looking at is primarily erections, vaginal lubrication, and galvanic skin responses, like things that are associated with our desire. Well, I guess we're going to sort that out. Our equipment and our ability to have sex. Okay. So when we're looking at arousal, I think it's important that we start to separate out the distinction between arousal and desire, because there are so many myths within our culture that create a lot of problems in this area. And we'll certainly get into that here in a moment. But I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about arousal non-concordance and that distinction between arousal and desire, and just kind of see what sorts of things you might be able to share with us about what's going on inside of our brains, inside of our bodies, that could help us understand that distinction.
Can you define for me what you mean by arousal non-concordance? For the audience, I mean, not for me.
Yeah,
I
right.
totally
No,
get
naturally. Yeah.
it.
So the reality is, we believe ourselves to
Mhm.
be able to like look at somebody's genitals and immediately tell whether or not they are desiring us, whether or not they're having a good time, whether or not they're enjoying sex.
Okay.
Sex, folks in like the sex positive space and advocates in this world have a lot of reasons to complain about 50 Shades of Grey and
Mm.
all of the like bullshit myths that are perpetrated by that particular book. But the first and probably most important one is this scene where the main character is tied up and is being beaten, and it's a sexual context. And even though you have her narration, even though you know from the perspective of the audience that she is not having a good time, that she does not want to be here, she does not like this guy, after spanking her for some period of time, he comes up between her legs, feels that she has vaginal lubrication, and makes some comment about how wet she is and how her body must be desiring this, even
Yeah.
though she's resisting it. And that myth is built on so much bad neuroscience and so much bad culture that I was hoping we could spend some time tonight kind of breaking it down and talking about where those ideas come from and the dangerous places that they might lead.
Oh, okay, perfect. No, I completely understand what you mean. So we had this conversation just briefly beforehand, and I think that this is something that's super important to talk about with as it relates to things like sexual assault, because there's this stigmatization that if somebody is sexually assaulted and they give any signs of like any standard signs that we would expect to see of sort of sexual physiological arousal. So like let's say like being wet, for example, or getting an erection or having an orgasm, that somehow means on some level that they are mentally engaged with and enjoyed what was happening to them. Because people don't have these great open conversations about what sex means physiologically and what your body responds to involuntarily. You can have these physiological reactions without enjoying and with it in fact with really being in a traumatic mental space. You can have these involuntary physiological reactions, and it can go on the opposite side of the spectrum too. You can really, for example, like if you want to talk about something like erectile dysfunction, you can really want to be, engaged in something that's going to give you an erection, but not have the physiological ability, but have that state of arousal. So it can go on both sides of the spectrum, but people just don't understand their bodies well enough because we don't have these open conversations about sex. And they don't realize that sometimes what your brain and your body are doing are not the same as what you are thinking about what's happening.
Yeah.
And that is a super important distinction. And
Yeah,
how you feel
or
about it.
how you feel
Yeah,
about
exactly.
it.
Or how you feel about it.
You know what it is that actually matters to you. Anytime you are wanting to know whether or not your partner or somebody else is turned on and whether or not they're like into it, you cannot tell that by looking at anything other than the words coming out of their mouth.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly if it's somebody that you're in a relationship with and you know what they like and you're following their facial cues and all of these kinds of things. Yeah, we can look at like physical arousal. We can look at erections and vaginal lubrication as, I guess, one data point, the same way that we can look at their, skin flush and the facial gestures, the sounds that they're making. I'm not trying to make it seem as if we are completely incapable of recognizing whether or not somebody is turned on. But I do want to suggest that the presence or lack of presence of an erection or the degree or lack of vaginal lubrication is not a valuable indicator. And if people understood that idea, how different would sexual assault be in our world? How different would the dialogue about the battle of the sexes and issues of men and women and so many of these things? I can't help but feel like this is an incredibly important idea that just not enough people are talking about.
Yeah, or conceptualizations of intimacy and what intimacy means from a physical perspective, because you can not want to follow. Like I think about asexual people a lot, because you can want to have intimate physiological experiences with people, like physical contact with people, and not necessarily want to follow that to what people see as its logical terminus.
Yeah.
And still have that intense experience in the way that means a lot to you and what you're looking for, and that's okay too. And you shouldn't be stigmatized for that. But we're just so unhealthy when we think of sex, because it's been so couched in all of this ridiculous, superfluous, unnecessary and harmful Christian wrapping paper.
Fair to say.
Yeah, it really is. Like, and not even just like religious wrapping paper of you can have not only can you only have sex in this context, you can only enjoy sex in this context. And not only can you only enjoy sex in this context, you absolutely have to, and you will enjoy sex in this context. And viewing it through that lens and seeing it as only one kind of thing, like, is the worst thing that you can do for people. It is so unhealthy, because they see it only as a reproductive task. They don't see it as something that they can do to relate to intimacy. They see it as potentially an obligation, or they see it as a right. And none of those are healthy perspectives to have on it.
Not to mention just the limiting force of it, because if sex is all about a erection and or vaginal lubrication, it becomes really easy to dismiss sex that doesn't involve an erection or vaginal penetration. So all of a sudden we have thrown out, millions of lesbians among other folks. But we also start to feel like sex has to include vaginal penetration with a penis until male orgasm, which is just not what sex is. If that is the only type of sex that exists, not only are we dismissing people who don't have penises, but we're dismissing the opportunity to, like you're saying, Shannon, to have sexuality that doesn't necessarily lead to that.
Yeah.
I'm so tired of the word foreplay and this idea that there is like actual sex and then all of these cute little sexy things that we do around sex. No, a blowjob is sex. Like you were talking about earlier, erotic audio and erotic literature, that can be sex. I mean, perhaps a form of solo sex or not. That can be partnered sex in a lot of different ways. There is nothing that you can really define about sex that would disinclude things like oral sex or digital sex or toys and all of these different kinds of things. And when we make it so much about just our genitals and whether they are hard or wet or whatever else, we miss out on so many opportunities for sexuality.
Yeah, and you can enjoy, maybe this is controversial, but I think that you can enjoy a sexual experience without an orgasm too. I think that, I think sometimes seeing an orgasm as an end goal it ruins the experience. Yeah, I think it
takes away the journey.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, because you're starting to try to make that happen instead of just experiencing what's currently going on with your partner or partners. And it can take away from it, in my mind, because now you're aiming for a goal instead of being in the moment. I don't know if that's a controversial take or not. I don't really care.
No, I mean, I think it's countercultural. It's a countercultural take, but I don't think it's a controversial one, at least not among, good sex positive folks that are doing the legwork here. So I'm glad that we're beating that drum and spreading that message. We've actually got a handful of calls coming in. If it's all right with you, let's jump on the lines. Yeah.
Heck yeah. Let's go.